What became of the city that once defined style, music, and defiance? London in the 1960s wasn't only a location, it was a rhythm, a vibe, a spark that ignited the world. Back then, the avenues weren't lined with high-end boutiques or luxury apartments, but with energy, ambition, and the smell of transformation. Teenagers dictated the culture, miniskirts took the place of etiquette, and the Who blasted from a cafe on Carnaby Street while a writer scrawled poetry in a Soho cellar. If this content speaks to you, don't let the story end here. Leave a comment, join the conversation, and help us keep these voices alive. Subscribe for more journeys through time, and together, let's ensure these cities are never forgotten. Without further ado, let's continue. London was raw and unrepentant. It was noisy, unruly, and alive with a spirit that couldn't be packaged or sold. Today we step back into that unforgettable era, not merely to look at it, but to feel it, to recall the London that dared, danced, and turned the world upside down. In the 60s, music in London was more than background noise, it was revolution. Legendary spaces such as the Marquee and Ronnie Scott's became sanctuaries for rising talent and cultural change. The Marquee introduced groups like the Rolling Stones and the Who, while Ronnie Scott's gave jazz nights their smoky soul. These rooms weren't polished or pristine, but their raw force defined the sound of a generation. To walk inside one of those venues was to step into history. It was sweaty, deafening, unpredictable, and that was exactly the purpose. Music wasn't just heard, it was lived, shoulder to shoulder with strangers who felt like family beneath dim lights that made everything seem possible. Behind closed doors, and soon in public, 60s London began confronting everything polite society had hushed. Topics like sex, identity, and desire shifted from scandal to art, from secrecy to freedom. Books were censored, plays condemned, but the barriers were falling. It wasn't noise for noise's sake, it was a reclaiming of autonomy. For the first time, people spoke openly of what it meant to love, to question, to exist beyond roles of tradition. And in that storm of change, a truth appeared: there was no turning back. If the city had a heartbeat in that decade, it pulsed through Soho and Carnaby Street. Blocks that were once ordinary became charged hubs of artistry and defiance. Cafes brimmed with creators, record shops screamed out fresh tracks, and every storefront declared another version of liberty. This wasn't merely retail or nightlife, it was the core of a cultural upheaval. Whether chasing vinyl, vintage clothes, or revolution, this was the destination. The world didn't only watch, it tried to imitate. London's explosion wasn't limited to clubs or couture, it spread to literature, theater, and the streets. Writers and dramatists broke sacred taboos with works that insisted on honesty, conflict, and necessity. Audiences gasped, divided, yet couldn't look away. The city was learning to raise its voice. What had been hidden became part of the conversation. From basement stages to Soho bookstores, London's voice grew sharper, braver, unmistakably human. Forget Paris or New York. For one dazzling moment, London was the planet's most electrifying city, a magnet for musicians, designers, thinkers, and dreamers. It wasn't following movements, it was creating them. Youth culture reached its center here, where conventions dissolved and potential dominated. Ideas crossed from cafes to workshops, from squats to salons. The world turned its eyes to London for what came next, and London delivered: wild, daring, experimental. It wasn't sleek, but it was alive, and that was what mattered. Fashion in the 60s erupted with boldness, intention, and fire. Mary Quant and shops like Biba reshaped fashion, not for aristocrats, but for the streets. The miniskirt was more than a garment. It was a declaration of independence, of daring to be visible. Clothing became political, personal, revolutionary. Gender boundaries blurred, and vibrant shades turned sidewalks into defiant runways. Style was no longer about conformity, it was about escape. And in 60s London, fashion meant everything. For the first time, youth weren't simply participants, they were the driving force. Teenagers and 20-somethings had disposable income, free time, and above all, influence. They dictated trends, determined coolness, and rewrote adulthood. From record labels to fashion houses, industries scrambled to catch up. Youth culture didn't ask for approval, it burst through barriers. London moved to their rhythm, and the rest of the world scrambled behind. In those years, working-class aspirations gained new foundations. Council estates spread across the capital, providing families with affordable homes. At the same time, education widened. Grammar schools, art colleges, and universities opened doors for those who had never dreamed of such chances. It wasn't only security, it was opportunity. A fresh creative class arose, powered not by privilege but by ambition and talent, supported by these new structures. From high-rises to ateliers, the city became a forge of reinvention, fueled by the belief that culture was for anyone to shape. With the arrival of Caribbean immigrants, London's neighborhoods evolved. Notting Hill, Brixton, and Hackney pulsed with calypso, reggae, and the aroma of jerk spices. The journey was hard, racism and backlash were constant, but something extraordinary took root. A cultural mosaic was forming, adding depth, flavor, and vitality to the city. London wasn't losing itself, it was transforming into something broader, stronger, and inclusive. Yet it wasn't only about music and nightlife. Beneath the parties, a political conscience was rising. Students filled Trafalgar Square, calling for peace and civil rights. From nuclear disarmament to racial equality, protest became almost a rite of passage. The streets were restless, demanding more. Victories weren't always clear, but the persistence helped forge London's soul, reminding all that silence was never the only path. Change in the 60s didn't whisper, it roared. Through vivid art, bold clothing, and fierce music, youth shook free from post-war grayness and leapt into psychedelic visions. Rebellion was reinvention. Creativity was the new force, worn on your body, strummed from a guitar, or stitched into a jacket. Young people didn't ask to be understood, they made themselves impossible to ignore. London's sound was the soundtrack of transformation. The Beatles weren't just a group, they were a cultural shift. The Rolling Stones tested limits with raw energy. The Who turned concerts into acts of defiance. These weren't chart toppers alone, they became identity, fueling teenage dreams and social movements alike. Their music was liberty, revolt, and London itself. In 1967, England and Wales decriminalized homosexuality between consenting adults. It was a watershed moment for civil rights. For many, it felt like the first crack in a wall that had long confined love and identity. Discrimination didn't end, but courage and visibility grew. Gay men could finally begin to live more openly, and London slowly became a place of possibility, not only silence. Around the same time, the contraceptive pill granted women control over their bodies and futures. Suddenly, marriage wasn't compulsory, and motherhood wasn't inevitable. Women could choose. That quiet revolution echoed in workplaces, schools, and relationships. It wasn't just contraception, it was self-determination. Feminism found its ally, and young women began writing their own narratives. The mod movement didn't stroll, it sped through London on Vespas, clad in sharp suits with soul records blasting. Every scooter mirror, cufflink, and dance step was intentional. This wasn't only fashion, it was defiance. Mods rejected the dull, grey Britain of their parents and demanded a faster, louder, modern world in their own image. By then, television had become the nation's mirror, showing Britons not just who they were but who they might become. Music shows, fashion figures, and counterculture symbols entered living rooms across the country. Twiggy, with her striking looks, became a household name overnight. TV didn't simply echo culture, it shaped it. Through its screens, a shared identity was forged. Now, those smoky jazz bars, neon-lit shops, marches, and miniskirts may feel like scenes from a dream. But for many, they were tangible, vivid, unforgettable. What about you? Did your parents or grandparents ever share stories of this wild, unrestrained London? The places they danced, the records they played, the clothes they wore, the ways they loved? We'd love to hear them. Share your stories in the comments. Because 60s London may be gone, but through memory, conversation, and storytelling, we can keep its pulse alive. The art world in 60s London was no less revolutionary than its music or fashion. Galleries that once showcased only traditional works began opening their doors to bold, experimental artists who pushed boundaries in both medium and message. Pop art exploded, with figures like David Hockney and Richard Hamilton blending consumer culture with social commentary. Suddenly, an advertisement, a collage, or even a street poster could be considered fine art. Creativity was no longer reserved for the elite. It was woven into the fabric of everyday life. London's nightlife became a laboratory of experimentation. Clubs like UFO and Middle Earth weren't merely places to dance. They were immersive experiences where psychedelic light shows, avant-garde films, and improvised performances turned nights into multisensory journeys. These were spaces where boundaries dissolved, between art and audience, performer and observer, reality and fantasy. For many, these nights were not just entertainment, but spiritual awakenings. Technology also began leaving its mark on culture. The transistor radio and the record player transformed how people consumed music, making it portable and personal in ways that were unthinkable just a decade before. Teenagers could now carry their soundtrack everywhere, carving out identities through the songs they played and the records they collected. In bedrooms across London, vinyl became the voice of rebellion and discovery. Even politics absorbed the energy of the era. The feminist movement was gaining visibility, student activism was impossible to ignore, and workers began demanding better pay and conditions in a rapidly modernizing economy. London, once a capital weighed down by the shadows of empire and war, was suddenly a place of momentum, charged, electric, and impatient for progress. 60s London wasn't just about excess or hedonism, it was about building a new future. It was about questioning the past and daring to imagine something different, even if it was messy, loud, or uncertain. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy of the time. Not the music charts, the runways, or even the protests, but the courage to believe that things could change, and the refusal to wait politely for permission. The streets themselves were alive with stories. Every brick, every alley, seemed to hum with history and possibility. Market stalls overflowed with goods from every corner of the globe, while neighbors shouted greetings from open windows. London wasn't just a city, it was a living organism, breathing with laughter, arguments, music, and the rhythm of daily life. Cafes and coffee houses became incubators for ideas. Writers, philosophers, and activists huddled over cups of tea or coffee, trading thoughts about politics, love, and art. Conversations spilled onto sidewalks, mixing with the sounds of buses, street musicians, and children playing. Each exchange added another thread to the city's cultural tapestry. The youth of London weren't waiting for permission, they were inventing culture from scratch. They experimented with clothing, music, slang, and lifestyles. Mods and rockers, hippies and soul fans, all created microcosms of style and thought, and each group left its mark on the city. The diversity of expression wasn't chaotic, it was a vibrant symphony of identity. Even public transport became part of the city's narrative. The underground carried workers, students, and dreamers alike. Conversations struck up between strangers, eyes met across carriages, and music spilled from portable record players. The tube wasn't just a commute, it was a stage for connection, a mobile reflection of London's energy. Nighttime illuminated a different London. Neon signs flickered on Leicester Square and Soho, while clubs pulsed with psychedelic colors. Street corners echoed with jazz, rock, and soul. The city didn't sleep, it shifted into a new rhythm after dark, where creativity thrived in shadows and music became a language of freedom. Television and radio amplified the city's influence. Programs broadcast fashion trends, new music, and radical ideas across the UK and beyond. Young people no longer needed to travel to experience culture. They could tune in and instantly feel part of a larger movement. London's influence spread, making it the epicenter of innovation in style, sound, and thought. Education also became a frontier for change. Art schools, universities, and colleges opened doors to students from working-class backgrounds. Talent and ambition mattered more than pedigree, and entire communities began to imagine futures previously out of reach. The city became a proving ground for reinvention, where creativity could translate into opportunity. Neighborhoods transformed with new cultural influences. Caribbean rhythms, Indian spices, and African traditions reshaped markets, streets, and social spaces. London wasn't erasing its history, it was enriching it. The mix of backgrounds gave the city depth, vibrancy, and a sense of possibility that no single neighborhood could contain. Even the political climate mirrored this energy. Demonstrations, sit-ins, and marches were as common as music gigs. The air was charged with debate and conviction, whether about nuclear disarmament, civil rights, or workers' struggles. Change wasn't polite or orderly, it was loud, visible, and impossible to ignore. London in the 60s was a city of contradictions. It was glamorous and gritty, chaotic and creative, rebellious and tender. Each corner held a story, each street was a stage, and every citizen was part of an experiment in living boldly. The decade didn't whisper change, it screamed it, and London became both the canvas and the paintbrush. The markets of London were vibrant arenas of culture and commerce. Stalls overflowed with fresh produce, records, books, and fabrics. Vendors shouted prices, children darted between the legs of shoppers, and neighbors exchanged gossip and recommendations. The market wasn't just a place to shop, it was a social hub, a stage for human connection, and a snapshot of the city's ever-changing life. Street art and graffiti began to creep onto walls, signaling a new way of claiming space. Londoners were decorating their environment not just with slogans, but with self-expression, humor, and rebellion. Murals, posters, and hand-painted signs became visual records of the city's energy, a proof that even walls could participate in the conversation of culture. Record shops were more than retail, they were cultural epicenters. From Soho to Camden, vinyl collections grew as teenagers hunted for the newest tracks. The moment someone discovered a record that spoke to their generation, a tiny spark of identity and community ignited. Every new release was not just music, but a declaration, a challenge, and a shared experience. Even cafes and diners reflected London's eclectic spirit. Waitresses and cooks came from diverse backgrounds, bringing flavors, slang, and stories into their kitchens. Students and artists scribbled notes on napkins, sketches on tablecloths, or plans for future projects. These spaces became informal incubators, where ideas mingled freely with food, coffee, and conversation. The Thames was a silent witness to all the transformation. Boats and barges carried cargo, tourists, and daydreams alike. Bridges became meeting points, spots for clandestine encounters or spirited debates. Walking along the river at night, one could feel the pulse of the city, calm on the surface but thrumming with creativity beneath. Fashion in London was a battlefield of expression. Beyond miniskirts and tailored suits, streetwear became a canvas of individuality. Leather jackets, bold prints, colorful tights, and eclectic accessories declared allegiances, attitudes, and beliefs. Clothing was no longer just functional, it was ideology worn on the body, a conversation with the world without saying a single word. Theaters and cinemas embraced the unconventional. Fringe performances challenged norms, experimental plays confronted taboo subjects, and films captured the city's pulse in vivid imagery. Every seat in a theater felt like participation in something larger than oneself, a society wrestling with change, daring to question, and celebrating creativity. Public transport became a crucible for culture. Underground trains, buses, and trams weren't merely commuting spaces, they were arenas for storytelling. Strangers shared songs, ideas, and debates. Posters advertising gigs, plays, and political movements plastered station walls, creating a constant dialogue between city life and urban imagination. Children of the 60s grew up immersed in this world of sounds, colors, and ideas. Every playground, park, and street corner offered lessons in observation, improvisation, and community. Games were played to the rhythm of nearby music, and the city itself became an extended classroom in resilience, creativity, and identity. Even at home, radios and early televisions connected families to global currents. News, music, and culture arrived simultaneously, creating shared reference points across social classes and neighborhoods. Londoners could be both citizens of their street and participants in a larger, global conversation. A city local in experience, yet international in influence. The coffee houses, pubs, and basements also became political stages. Debates on civil rights, anti-war sentiment, and social reform were as frequent as the music notes that floated between tables. Ideas didn't remain abstract. They manifested in action, marches, and grassroots initiatives. London was learning that change required both thought and movement. If these memories moved you, don't let the story end here. Leave a comment, join the conversation, and help us keep these voices alive. Subscribe for more journeys through time, and together, let's ensure these cities are never forgotten. See you next time.